If you want to get more out of your applications, then you need to know which parts of your code are consuming the most resources. Today's show is brought to you by gProfiler, an open source profiling tool for code performance in production. gProfiler is the must-have tool for performance and cost optimization, enabling any team to reap the benefits of continuous profiling and proactively look for optimization opportunities. gProfiler can be deployed cluster-wide in just minutes with no code changes or deployment modifications whatsoever. And best of all, it's free. So start profiling today at gprofiler.io. That's gprofiler.io.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. A Sunday show, not a Sunday perspective, but we, as we've said before, we will try and mostly do Sunday perspectives. But sometimes we get either overloaded with the number of really good interviews that we've had, or we just we get a chance to fit in a really interesting topic on a Sunday instead of a Sunday perspective. So not only gives me a break a little bit from coming up with some topic ideas, but also gives us a little more leeway in terms of having some flexibility of getting great guests and great interviews on the show. So today's going to be one of those days. Hope everybody's doing well. Quick update. It is I'm recording this on the 19th of November. You're probably listening to this on the 20th of November, sometime later. As of right now, Twitter still works. So last week's Sunday perspective was, kind of not so much a foreshadowing. I heard someone say it was a eulogy for Twitter. Our hope is that Twitter survives. It's an important tool for us. I think it's an important tool for the whole community. What it'll look like, who knows? But as of right now, as of the 19th or 20th of November, it is still running, still free as for most people, I guess, and still providing some useful information. So with that, I'm going to jump right into our guest. We're going to jump into the interview here in a second. Aaron is sort of taking over Sunday. This is, I guess, to a certain extent, Aaron's Sunday perspective. We're going to have a chance to talk to Ken Lane, who is one of the truly OG folks who focuses on APIs and has focused on APIs for a very long time, is the founder of API Evangelist and is over at Postman. But Ken's somebody who we've known, we followed for a long time. It's the first time we've had him on the show, but we followed him for a long time and really was somebody who, as we've been growing up trying to learn about APIs and their role, both from a technology perspective and a business perspective, has always been somebody that we've really followed quite a bit. So this is going to be a great interview. Ken has tons and tons of background on both how to get started in this space, but also lifecycle, governance, security, the evolution of APIs and things like GraphQL and lots of other stuff. So really excited to get to that, and we will get to it right after the break. Today's show is brought to you by Datalore, a collaborative data science platform from JetBrains. Datalore brings together a first-class coding experience for data scientists using Python, SQL, R, and Scala in Juniper notebooks, a modern BI with interactive data apps and easy ways to share your insights with stakeholders, and a live team collaboration on notebooks and no-code automations. You can install Datalore with Docker or Kubernetes in your private cloud or on-premises and be sure that your data doesn't leave your environment. Datalore is free for teams of up to 4 people. Start for free at datalore.team/cloudcast and use the code CLOUDCAST for a 5% purchase discount. That's datalore.team/cloudcast. Buffering. How annoying. Did you know that 17 out of 20 people stop watching a video because of stalling and rebuffering? Don't let your users click away to a competitor's site. If your business lies in online media, rely on CDN77 to deliver a seamless online experience to your audience. CDN77 is one of the leading global providers of content delivery network services. They power the world's most popular websites and apps, such as Udemy, ESL Gaming, live sports TV, and social media platforms. Aside from their massive and redundant global network, you're going to love their no BS attitude and skilled team of engineers ready to help 24/7. No chatbots, no tickets bouncing around unresolved for days, just people who know your use case and can immediately help you pinpoint and fix the problems. Don't wait until your users run out of patience. Go to cdn77.com/cloudcast and ask for a free trial with no duration or traffic limits. That's cdn77.com/cloudcast.
And we're back, and this week, we're going to be talking about APIs. And by the way, APIs is something, this is Aaron, by the way. If you've been following the podcast, it's been kind of a side hobby lately, a side area of interest that I've been studying, especially around API security in particular. And as we've always said, we wanted to get some of the best and the brightest on here and learn from them. So today, we have Ken Lane, founder of the API Evangelist site and chief evangelist at Postman. How you doing, Ken?
I'm doing very well today. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And Ken, for those out there that maybe haven't heard of you, give everyone a brief introduction.
Oh, well, I guess I'm an old database guy from the 1980s, but this thing happened around 2000-ish that caught my attention, this web API thing that companies like Amazon and Salesforce were using. And by 2006, I started it caught my eye because the cloud was kind of APIs. This mobile phone that's in our pocket now was all APIs. And 2010, I just started paying attention to it full time. And 12 years later, 13 years later, here I am at Postman. I'm now their chief evangelist, but basically just spend my days studying not just the technology, but the business and what I consider the politics of APIs.
Yeah, and that actually is a great segue into the first topic I wanted to talk about, because I feel like, well, first of all, you've been doing the API Evangelist site about as long as we've been doing the podcast. And so for both of us, we've kind of come up and seen a bunch of trends, and you were kind of doing APIs before APIs were cool. And so tell everyone a little bit, especially folks that maybe are new, because our audience tends to be, practitioners, solutions architects, a little bit of venture capital, folks that like to explore emerging technologies. And even though APIs is an older technology, APIs as a trend, I feel like, especially API security, is an emerging trend. So tell everyone about, first of all, API Evangelist site, and then how to get started.
Yeah, I mean, API Evangelist started, I was working at SAP. I ran all North American events for SAP, a company that contracted that. And I was asked 2006 to scale the event. And I used the Amazon cloud before it was cool and to do the job. And I automated it with APIs. And then in 2008, I took over Google's North American events, and I did Google I/O, Google Dev Days, and it happened to be the first event they were giving away Android phones. And Google asked us to use a bunch of these different APIs to build applications for the event experience. And so 2009, 10, I was just started studying this kind of rise of these looser, kind of scrappier types of APIs, because I'm an old enterprise architect. I worked in the service-oriented architecture realm. And so, as you said, APIs aren't anything new, but this kind of breed of scrappier, lighter weight JSON APIs, we're doing a lot of different things. I mean, it was growing Twitter, it was growing Amazon, Facebook, Twilio. And I just really saw it as the undercurrent behind not just web applications, but mobile applications, and then devices like Nest and others that were emerging. In 2010, when I quit my job, I was VP of this events company, and all my friends thought I was crazy. They're like, "What are you doing? You're focusing on just web APIs? Like, that's not even a thing." And I kept studying, kept looking at what was happening, and I just noticed it was everywhere. I compare myself to that kid in The Sixth Sense, where he sees dead people everywhere. I just see APIs, and eventually it caught up with me. I mean, 2016, it started going mainstream. Insurance companies, banks, government agencies, healthcare, and now it's just really it's the undercurrent behind everything that we do. And it's not just the technology, it's how we do business, it's how we make new revenue streams. And increasingly it's showing that's how politics and policy is made associate around APIs.
Yeah. Thank you for that, because it's an interesting journey for sure. And it's something, it makes perfect sense in hindsight, but it's not something I necessarily really thought about a lot until recently. And also, you mentioned, business and politics. So let's talk about that, because as you mentioned on the API Evangelist website, I mean, the headline of the website, when you first go to the website, is making sense of technology, business, and politics of APIs since 2010. And so tell everyone a little bit what you mean by that, because the business and politics side maybe doesn't come as naturally to some of us.
Yeah, it's similar to the tech. It's invisible. Like APIs are hard to see, quote unquote, see, and it takes a lot of work to see it. And so the business and how they're wielded. So I'll give you one of the more high profile examples right now is Facebook is being investigated. There's a lawsuit from the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission in the United States, for anti-competitive practices in their API ecosystem. So let me set the stage. What does that mean? Well, it's you're an API provider. One of the little known secrets of your API, you build an API, a public API. You have a developer ecosystem. People come and build things, amazing things. The entire Twitter ecosystem was built on the API, all the mobile apps, everything. So Facebook set up theirs and everyone came. Remember, Zynga came, everyone built games. It was like just a really amazing time, 2008, 10. But what you do in your API ecosystem is you do talent acquisition. When people are building cool things, you hire them. That's your number one way of hiring people, because they get your platform, they get your product, they're building things, they're innovative. And then when you're looking to compete and build new features, you research it in your API ecosystem. So when Facebook was like, hey, we're going to go more in on images, like what should we do with images? They looked out at their ecosystem and they said, well, here's number 1, 2, and 3 apps in our ecosystem doing things with images. We're going to buy one of them, Instagram. We're going to buy Instagram. They seem to be doing cool things. And then they looked out and they said, we want to do messaging. Who's doing messaging? Well, WhatsApp. WhatsApp's doing messaging, and there's number 2, 3, 4. We'll just buy WhatsApp rather than building our own. And then you know what? It sucks to be number 2 and 3 in that equation, because if you're number 2 and 3, everything just became a hell of a lot harder for you in that ecosystem. When it comes to rate limits, when it comes to onboarding, approvals, everything slows down for you because your competitors just got prioritized and you became a target. So Facebook's being investigated for that anti-competitive practice, which actually is a pretty common thing you do in API ecosystems. And it's just a matter of whether you're doing it ethically, transparently or not. Amazon does it, Google does it. We all use our API ecosystems to build out and world build our future and compete with potentially our consumers who we're working alongside.
Yeah, and I'll add another one to that. What that kind of came to my attention, and this is years ago at this point, the Twitter API, right? The Twitter API, once upon a time, was super open, and there was a very rich ecosystem of Twitter clients, right? There was TweetDeck and TweetBot and all of these others, and over time they kind of closed that ecosystem down of like, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but as I understood it, as they introduced new features, the new features weren't necessarily in the open APIs available to the clients. It became like more of a closed API, to the point that they started to, I won't say completely kill the ecosystem over time, but certainly put a dent in it.
Yeah, no, it's something they've started recovering from. They've with the V2, they have a more of a business model, so you can actually start paying them for API access. And so that leveled the playing field a little bit. But yeah, that sent shockwaves across the developer community. And a lot of people said, I'm not going to play in the ecosystem because of that behavior.
Sure. Now, so let's kind of move on then, because we did briefly touch on it. We often hear phrases like, hey, we're a cloud first company, or we're an API first company. You hear these kind of thrown around. What exactly does that mean, in your terminology? And also help everyone out while we're talking terminology. Like when we say like open API or GraphQL, for somebody who's just getting started, what's like the base terminology we need to understand when we're API first?
Well, let's start with the API first, and then we'll dive into the different types of APIs and flavors and patterns there. So API first means that you prioritize APIs over any application of those APIs, and you're committed to a composable view of the enterprise of what your business is. And so what that means is, along the way, why APIs became such a thing is you were doing it for websites, maybe some widgets, some different affiliate programs to deliver content from other locations onto your website. And then pretty soon you started doing mobile applications, and you started publishing APIs for those. And then partners came along and said, hey, we want access to some of that data. We want to use those. And what happened along the way is a lot of those teams didn't always talk to each other. So you ended up with redundant APIs behind mobile apps, behind partners, behind web apps. And you see a lot of API sprawl or API chaos these days because APIs are everywhere and not a single organization knows where all their APIs are. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're Twilio, you're Stripe, you're the US government. You don't know where all your APIs are. And that's the biggest problem right now is dealing with that sprawl. So by being an API first, you're prioritizing the APIs, you're building APIs independent of any way that those APIs are used. And so you have a strategy, you have a comprehensive catalog and way of searching, and you have a standard way of designing them so they behave similarly across teams and across lines of business. And so being API first is just about prioritizing and seeing the APIs, because there's other pieces of infrastructure, there's other parts of your apps, but they are the pipes that all the data, information, and algorithms move through. And that's where that business and politics I talked about, that's where those control points are for your business. So it's really critical that you prioritize this. And that's when you're building apps. I'm also talking API first is prioritizing APIs before you buy a SaaS solution, before you buy any software solution. Does this system have an API that I can get my data in and out? So I'm not locked into this vendor. And so you see APIs have been the undercurrent of the whole SaaS evolution too. So it's not just producing APIs, it's also the APIs that you consume. So that's the API first definition. I can pause there before I dive into the rest.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. That's a great explanation. Thank you. Go ahead and continue with the rest.
So along that way with the evolution of APIs, like in 2000, the main type of API that's out there is what's called RESTful APIs, web APIs, HTTP APIs. They kind of come from several names, but they're just leveraging the web. And instead of HTML coming back for a web page, you get JSON back. It's very simple, very cheap, very low cost. And that's the baseline for all APIs out there. Everyone has those. It's not going away. But there's other experiences that are kind of required on top of APIs. And one of them was we saw this growth in the use of single page applications like React and others to deliver not just web, but also mobile app experiences. And those are API driven, but a lot of folks needed more access to the data. When you're designing an app, you need more access than the API maybe had. So they started, Facebook to support this, started a thing called GraphQL, which is now open source, but it uses HTTP, but instead of simple endpoints, you have access to the whole data schema, and you can craft your own query. It's kind of like SQL, but on the web. And that allows developers to do a lot more. And GraphQL has emerged as a pretty powerful way to not just deliver web apps, but also and single page apps, but connect many different data sources together. And then along the way also, you need more real-time experiences. So we've seen things like Kafka, WebSockets, and others. These are APIs that don't always use HTTP. A lot of them use TCP, which is another way of a more real-time, low-level way of communicating. And but it's using APIs in a way that's called event-driven, meaning you can publish data to it in real time. Just here you go, here's a bunch of data. And then you can subscribe to different topics. And anytime something new and a new order shows up, a new Bitcoin price fluctuation, you can subscribe to that and get notified in real time that something happened. So you don't have to like request, hey, did something change? Hey, did something change? You'll be notified. And then lastly, there's another format called gRPC out of Google, which is kind of, think of it as the industrial grade pipes for your enterprise. It's the real high volume, high throughput internal APIs that you use to connect your systems together and it move data around, large volumes of data around quickly. So this toolbox of REST, GraphQL, gRPC, WebSockets, Kafka has emerged to kind of cover a whole wide range of needs you're going to come across in the enterprise when it comes to your digital transformation. We'll call it that.
Yeah, and that's super helpful because we always like to think about everything in stacks, right? Like whether you're doing something in public cloud and like, here's your stacks and here's, your application and your containers and your DNS and your gateways and all these other things. But at the end of the day, everything is some kind of top to bottom stack. So that's super helpful. Absolutely. Now let's talk about API first companies, because I feel like in the public cloud space, there's always poster children. Like in the public cloud space, it was always like, hey, you want to be like Netflix or you want to be like Uber. And I feel like in the API space, it's always, hey, you want to be like Twilio, you want to be like Stripe. And I like you mentioned both of those, or you want to be like SendGrid. And like, are those still valid examples? And also, what does it even mean to kind of be an example?
Yeah, I mean, Twilio and Stripe are interesting poster children because, you want to emulate them. They do a lot of things right. I would say first and foremost, they kind of follow that Unix principle, but in an online distributed web world that you want to do one thing and do it well. So Twilio is SMS. That was their first claim to fame is you can send and receive SMS, and it's super simple to use. It's well documented. It's the time to first call is so quick and painless. You can get up sending messages to each other in an app. And SendGrid was the same way for email, and Stripe is for payments. So these are fundamental building blocks of the app economy. So think about everything we use during COVID here to get food delivery, grocery delivery, to get our taxi rides, Uber. Those all require you sending and receiving SMSs and receiving payments, making and receiving payments. So these are fundamental building blocks, and they just did them well. They were simple, well documented. They got developers. It spoke to developers, and they didn't do a lot of other things. You landed on Twilio.com. It spoke to you as a developer. You didn't have to go look for that link in the bottom that said, hey, API or developer, because it's a second class citizen for a platform. It was the primary. They provide these models for how we should do things. Now, I'll put an asterisk on that. A decade later, you still want to follow that model, but it's kind of interesting that you don't see a whole lot of other poster children right now. And I find that I'm not sure why there's not a whole bunch of other Stripes and Twilios. If this is a winning formula, why aren't there more folks doing it? I would say it's probably like everyone's just doing a bunch of different APIs. It's like in the early days of the web, you stood out, but now you're in a sea of people doing API first, and it's harder to stand out because everyone's got APIs now. But it's an interesting question, I think, worthy of discussion.
Yeah. And I'll add to this. If you're an API first company or want to be an API first company, the biggest thing to consider if you ever want to be a poster child is the concept of a life cycle. And we talked about it a little bit, and this is where we can, let's talk about Postman a little bit as well. To your exact point, like this was when it was super early on. I don't think it necessarily was applied like a product, right? It wasn't thought of as a product. But now you have entire API teams with development and product management and full life cycle of, versioning, and things are rolled out and it's a service and you've got to deprecate it at some point. And if you deprecate it, what is the, ramifications to who knows who is calling that? And so tell everyone a little bit about like, hey, what are the typical steps that you see and how does Postman fit into all of this as well?
Well, so there's a lot of, depending on who you ask, the life cycle is different. Everyone's got opinions, but the most common way you approach the life cycle, I have a formal definition, is you define your API. What are the business requirements? You design that API. You develop that API locally or usually in a team structure. We see a lot more trends towards shifting things left in that life cycle. So right after that design or as part of it, you write your test-driven development. You tend to apply a lot of security practices early on, and then you actually deploy that API. But then once that API is deployed, you've got to observe and distribute that API. You got to make sure it's available for consumers to access. So define, design, develop, test, secure, deploy, observe, and distribute. That's what I consider the formal life cycle. But that's a producer life cycle. That's only one side of the coin. Your consumers have to discover that API. They have to be able to find it. They have to be able to explore and kick the tires and be able to see how it works. Then they have to integrate with it. Then they have to actually observe and understand how they're using it as well and manage their consumption and access to it. So there's a virtuous producer and consumer life cycle that all has to work together. And then this, where it gets to in the last couple of years, the biggest trend that I'm seeing is treating these APIs as a product. And so that means a lot of the things you said is you have feedback loops between that producer and consumer. Those consumers are giving feedback in real time. Those requirements are gathered back into the define phase, and you repeat for each version. And this means that more business stakeholders are involved in the conversation. As you said, there's product managers involved, there's product marketers, there's not just developers doing it anymore. And this is the biggest shift in the last couple of years, I would say, is the common story. Like I was out in Cincinnati and all over Ohio a couple months back talking to Kroger and talking to Nationwide Insurance. So these are like bedrock enterprises and of America. And they're all, well, we did this whole API thing. We launched a portal, a bunch of public APIs. We held some hackathons. We ate some pizza and we built some apps. They were cool. They didn't really make a dent on our business. But once we started bringing in product managers and treating these APIs as products, building in these feedback loops with customers, employing a life cycle, treating them as living things, not just some checkbox on a project and then you're done. Then we started seeing things shift. We started seeing more business alignment. We started seeing these APIs actually move the needle when it comes to our relationships with partners. Treating them as a product has really shifted things the last couple of years, and it's at a time where you can't just be doing tech for the sake of tech. You got to be doing it and delivering some business value. Otherwise, it's just not worth the doing.
Yep, completely agree. And I'll add to that too. What is your thoughts on security around it as well? Because as things get treated as a product, obviously, and the more popular it becomes, the more people that have access to it. But you look at, there's been some of the most famous data breaches that you hear about on the news, with millions and millions of records at times. A lot of times it's because of an API security error. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, that's very correct. I mean, this is sprawl that's out there, and most of these are something pretty trivial when you left open. It's a really simple authentication thing, or like the Equifax data breach, which was, I think, a contest API that was set up temporarily. So it's an ephemeral API that's only meant to be up for a few months, but no one took it down, which means it didn't ever get updated with any patches, and it just became a vector. And so a lot of the reasons we're doing APIs all over the place, or just don't always have that discipline that I talked about earlier to test them, to secure them, and to know where they are. I mean, that's really the first part about security is if you don't know where your APIs are, you're not going to be able to secure them. And no organization knows where their APIs are right now. None. I don't care who you are. And so knowing where your APIs are, having a standardized lifecycle across all your APIs so that you can then shift left security earlier on, scan, fuzz, use standard authentication and authorization, have logging, observability, traceability, all those things you're going to have in a more mature life cycle. You can do all of that and minimize those risks, those APIs being out there that have vulnerabilities that are forgotten about. And then we can start talking about, more sophisticated security approaches. But just that baseline would do so much for organizations. Sure,
absolutely. And I'm going to wrap it up with one question, but also just a quick plug, a shameless plug for you on behalf of you. The things we just talked about, the Breaking Changes podcast, your podcast, is fantastic. And if I remember correctly, it comes out like 2 times-ish a week. But I've been learning a lot from your podcast. So thank you very much for that. But final question, and I'll kind of wrap us up. I noticed here recently you've been kind of digging into government APIs as one area of research. But what is your focus these days? And I mean, we talked about some emerging trends, but what's the latest emerging trends that you are seeing?
Ooh, well, the treating APIs as a product is, I would say, that by far the top one. Security being right there, and governance. So doing APIs consistently at scale across organizations. This is why I'm in Boston instead of Oakland, California right now, talking governance with a large global consulting firm. So treating them like products, securing them, and governing your operations at scale are really the top concerns. I wouldn't even call them trends. But you asked me about the government. That the government APIs for me are really kind of the through line through my career and through my passion and belief in APIs. 2013, I took a moment and went and worked for the Obama administration doing API strategy for the Obama. He made a mandate that all agencies need to go machine readable by default. If you're publishing public data, it needs to be available in a machine readable format, JSON, XML. And I was the guy who went around telling agencies they needed to do that. And so I kind of caught the bug working on government APIs and seeing the importance of them and the value they can bring. And I've worked since then on several policies around like if you are a state that wants to do business with the federal government, so Center for Medicaid and Medicare, you have to have what's called a FHIR compliant API. This is actually regulatory. So you have to have a specific type of healthcare API for making healthcare records interoperable. And so this is why I'm at Postman. I mentioned in their security and governance is I work with our largest organizations to think through how they manage API operations, the life cycle, apply security and governance across that. And it's the same is going to apply at the industry level. So you want to govern all your APIs, you want to know where they are, you want them to be consistent. This is what you want in industry. So the top 2 industries right now have regulations that are API focused. So PSD2 in Europe regulates banking, FHIR in the US regulates healthcare. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So in many years, you'll see APIs are mandated for certain industries and they've got to speak and behave in a certain way. And so I'm a big fan of government's role in that. Kind of changed my tune. I grew up very libertarian, but once I went and saw how government actually works, I'm a big fan of APIs and the transparency and interoperability they bring. So I'm going to be working at Postman as long as I possibly can, but that's my career trajectory is to keep working in DC on API policy.
Fantastic. That's a great place to close us out. So, Ken, anyone that's interested, we've mentioned some websites and some podcasts and everything's in the show notes. Where else can everyone follow you, ask you a question, and find out more?
APIevangelist.com, Postman.com is where I do most of my magic. But you can, find me on the Twitters if Twitter's going to still be around here. And Ken Lane, my name's pretty unique, KINLANE. I'm pretty easy to find.
Fantastic. All right. So thank you very much for your time this week, Ken. And thank you, everyone, for listening. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts, and please tell a friend as well. And on behalf of Brian, who wasn't able to make it this week, thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk to everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.